Over the course of a 75-year history of Formula One, drivers have come and gone with various levels of success and recognition. The best of the best get plaudits for their fantastic performances, and those with less talent fizzle out quietly after a few seasons. Those who have long and fruitful careers tend to be appreciated for their skills, but often media narratives and fan opinion can alter the perception of someone's ability or their reputation as a competitor. Take the examples of Ayrton Senna and Alain Prost. Nowadays, the former is revered as a fallen gladiator and the only golden prophet of his era, whereas the guy who beat him in the points standings, both of the years they were teammates, and had the talent to claim he was the best driver in every season, bar one or two, for a whole decade, is seen as a supervillain because of his ability to play the political game in the sport. There are more nuances to the biggest rivalry in the history of F1, but this is still a perfect example of how media and fan interpretations can make or break a driver's legacy through no fault of their own. Guys like Prost, who tended not to make aggressive passes or endear themselves to the fans with truly generational turns of speed, tend to slip under the radar because the only one of his races that is often mentioned in this vein is his victory at the 1990 Mexican Grand Prix, whereas Senna has bucket loads of examples, from his stellar wet weather drives at Monaco in 1984 and Donington in 1993, to his astounding qualifying lap around the Principality in 1988 that saw him usurp his French rival by 1.4 seconds. While Prost certainly had countless more fantastic performances that I haven't detailed here, the point remains that his eternal rival Senna's legacy is far more well documented and his flashpoints are highlighted far more often. While I could go on forever about the most iconic teammate tussle in F1 history, that's not what this video is about. Instead, it concerns another driver that happened to partner Prost during his career, one that has a story of its own that is just as interesting, if not more so, depending on the metric you use. With that being said, let's get into this video and discuss F1's most underrated champion. Let me set the scene. It's 1971. A young and budding racing driver had just paid his way onto the Formula 2 grid with the recently established, but nonetheless competitive and successful March outfit, the chassis constructor that would lead Sweden's Ronnie Peterson to the feeder series crown as well as runners-up in that year's F1 standings behind two-time champion Jackie Stewart. The field was full with former and current top category prospects, such as the Argentine Carlos Reutemann, who would go on to have a decade-long spell collecting wins with the likes of Brabham, Ferrari and Williams in Formula 1, and another driver often deemed unlucky not to be crowned world champion, the Ulsterman John Watson, to sporadic podium finishes or one-time race winners like Tim Schenken and Jean-Pierre Jarier, who were decent enough to drive midfield cars to impressive results, especially Jarier, who grabbed 3 podiums for the likes of Shadow and a fallen Tyrrell outfit, as well as a trio of pole positions. Also amongst these hopefuls was the United States Grand Prix winner at Watkins Glen from that year, Francois Sever, who entered 3 races and won 2 before focusing fully on the top tier where he partnered the incumbent champion Stewart. However, amongst these recognisable faces was a fairly anonymous competitor who scored points just 3 times despite participating in all but 1 round of the season, albeit claiming a podium at the old Rouen-les-Essarts circuit in France. This seemingly average driver had come from a wealthy background which should have given him a leg up in the world of racing, but due to disapproval from his family, he had to take out a life insurance policy tied to his racing exploits in order to acquire the funds necessary to compete. Those versed in their motorsport history will now already know who I'm talking about, but when this upstart made his debut in Formula 1 at the Österreich Ring in Austria, alongside his first season in the second tier, no one really noticed. He qualified on the back row of the grid and retired within 20 laps due to handling problems, ruffling no feathers and didn't make another start for the rest of the year. The March outfit saw something in the youngster despite his quiet results, and he drove a dual campaign in both F1 and his supplementary junior series, finishing 5th in his second tier standings behind Reutemann again, another underrated 70s Grand Prix prospect Patrick Depailler, eventual 2-time 24 Hours of Le Mans winner Jean-Pierre Jousseau, and 9-time motorcycle champion Mike Hailwood, who'd recently switched from 2 wheels to 4 full-time. However, in Formula 1, he had a pointless campaign with the best result of 7th in Kyalami, and with his team going from podium contenders to midfielders at best, our protagonist was on the move. Considering I've been very secretive and whimsical about him, to the point where it's probably doing your head in a little bit, you're probably expecting some grand reveal of the prodigy you've spent the entire video so far not knowing for certain. And that's exactly what's coming. Upon his sophomore campaign in F1, the young Austrian, Niki Lauda, partnered established driver Clay Regazzoni at the BRM outfit in an attempt to find a team with a competitive edge. Regazzoni was a fantastic driver who had finished third in his rookie season in 1970 despite missing 5 of the 13 rounds that year, and the British team were former Constructors' champions in the hands of a great inspiration for Dick Dastardly, Graham Hill, and they were also recent Grand Prix winners thanks to a fantastic wet weather drive from Jean-Pierre Beltoise at Monaco the year prior in 1972. The P160E chassis used throughout most of the 73 season was a good platform, being nimble and easy to drive, but it lacked power from an in-house V12 engine that was woefully unreliable. Lauda failed to finish 9 of the 15 races, and didn't even start his home race in Austria, thanks to suffering from an injured wrist picked up from crashing out of a German Grand Prix on the Nürburgring Nordschleife. From his 5 race finishes, he scored points only once with 5th in Zolder, but his most impressive performance came when he was running in 3rd place at Monaco before being scuppered by gearbox trouble on lap 24, meaning he couldn't claim his maiden podium. Nicky's more experienced BRM counterpart Regazzoni rejoined the Scuderia for 1974, and when Il Commendatore, Enzo Ferrari, inquired to the Swiss about the talents of his ex-teammate, Clay was so resounding in his approval of the youngster that Enzo hired him shortly after so the pair could partner each other again. The Ferrari outfit was undergoing a change in direction after their 1973 lineup of Jackie Ickx and Arturo Merzario claimed 0 podiums and only achieved 6th in the constructors' standings, their joint worst finish in history until that point, and the only instance where they had 2 full-time drivers gunning for points yet were still struggling. The first season of the Ferrari rebuild saw the new teammates duo grab a double podium finish at the opening round in Buenos Aires, while Lauda secured his first career pole position in Kyalami, followed by his second start from the front as well as the fastest lap and win at the Spanish Grand Prix. The final F1 race held at the Nivelles-Borloo circuit in Belgium saw Niki claim runners-up less than half a second behind Emerson Fittipaldi, as despite showing winning pace, the Austrian couldn't pass him on a difficult-to-overtake layout. Lauda was leading at the Monaco Grand Prix when he retired with ignition trouble just before the halfway mark, then went out of the event after in Sweden with gearbox problems. After winning at Zandvoort, Niki moved to within 1 point of the championship leader Fittipaldi, and from that race to the third from last one in Monza, Lauda achieved 6 consecutive pole positions, but mechanical issues and a first lap crash at the Nürburgring Nordschleife all but curtailed his chances at a title. He failed to finish any of the final 5 races, and ended the year 4th in the driver's standings behind his more experienced teammate Regazzoni, albeit with 9 retirements compared to the Swiss's 3. The Austrian youngster had proven he had bundles of raw talent, but needed to refine his craft heading into the 1975 season, although the campaign got off to a poor start as he only finished 6th in Argentina at the Oscar de Juan Galvez circuit, then got 2 5th places in Interlagos and Kyalami before retiring from a first lap collision at the infamous Spanish Grand Prix at Montjuic Park. He came back with a resurgence at Monaco though, winning from pole position there, before taking victory again at the next 2 rounds in Zolder and Anderstorp. Ferrari fumbled their tyre strategy in changeable conditions at Zandvoort, allowing James Hunt to take a historic win for Hesketh Racing while their driver got second, but Lauda was back on top again in Paul Ricard. 4 wins in 5 races put Niki almost double the points of any other driver, but he only got 8th in Silverstone thanks to a late hailstorm that sent many of the top runners out of contention. Then he had more bad luck in Germany while leading when he got a puncture halfway round the enormously long lap of the Nürburgring Nordschleife, although he recovered to 3rd. It didn't rain in Austria, but it poured for everyone, literally, as the race had to be brought to a stop early due to adverse weather conditions, but Niki's car also wasn't set up for such events, and he fell from pole position to a 6th place finish. Then he cruised to 3rd at Monza, where he sealed the championship with 1 round remaining, and the Constructors 2 for Ferrari. Despite the last race meaning nothing, he still took another pole and victory combo, his 9th start from the front of the year, and his 5th win, amassing a 19.5 point gap over 2nd place Fittipaldi. Lauda's first championship took a mix of raw pace, a bit of luck, but also incredible race management, and while his rivals often had issues that led to race retirements, Niki often recovered to make something from a bad situation. With that being said, the next season would be a story even more centred around recovery. In the first 7 races of 1976, Lauda's results were as follows: first, second, first, 3rd. Even after a retirement from a lead in Paul Ricard and a 2nd place behind James Hunt in Brands Hatch, he still had a points advantage worth more than 2 race victories. Then came the German Grand Prix. We all know the story of this race. Lauda spearheaded a movement to try and have it cancelled on safety grounds due to adverse weather conditions making the already outdated and outgoing circuit far too dangerous. After a vote from the drivers that saw those in favour of racing win by 1, the track dried up somewhat ahead of the start, and everyone was debating whether slicks or wet tyres were more suitable for the gargantuan lap around the Eifel Mountains. Most opted for the safe choice of grooved rubber, but the German Jochen Mass knew the weather patterns of the area well and chose the riskier, drier option, believing conditions would lighten up. He was right, and everyone bar Ronnie Peterson and a few others came in to put on slicks at the end of the first lap, as he'd rocketed from 9th to 3rd at the start and was bound to overtake Peterson for the lead at the end of the first tour around the track. Lauda was one of those who switched tyres, and while pushing to make up for lost time, he crashed at Bergwerk, enveloping his car in flames as his helmet was torn off by the impact. 4 brave drivers saw their fellow competitor in grave danger and jumped into action, as Guy Edwards, Brett Lunger, Harald Ertel and Arturo Merzario assisted in rescuing the burning Austrian. Merzario was the only one who knew how Ferrari's unique seatbelt mechanism worked, having previously tested for the Scuderia, and after 55 seconds trapped in the blaze, they got Lauda out of the burning wreckage and he was transported to hospital where he would lay in critical condition. Back on the track, Hunt won the restarted race and closed to within 14 points of a championship lead asserted by his rival, who was now fighting for his life. What was previously an almost certain second crown was now a matter of whether he'd live to see Hunt lift the trophy at the end of the year. The movie Rush shows Lauda watching footage of the races where everyone was eating into his points advantage while having his stomach pumped to remove the dangerous and nasty smoke and chemicals he'd inhaled during the crash, and whether this depiction of events was true or a matter of fiction. Despite it being read his last rites twice by a priest, he was back behind the wheel within 6 weeks at the Italian Grand Prix with bandages covering his fresh scars. James Hunt reportedly said, when the pair met each other for the first time after the crash, he told Nicky that he was the only person who could have his face half burnt off and still come out the other side better looking. While that shows their camaraderie and Hunt's unequivocally unique sense of humour, this was a recovery of epic proportions. On a physical note, Lauda experienced immense pain by simply putting on his helmet over his bandages for a short period of time, and no doubt the rest of his body would be similarly wounded, but there's also a mental side to this. I know mental health wasn't a thing in this era, but to act like anyone else wouldn't be emotionally exhausted, frightened, or simply destroyed after an accident of those proportions would be simply wrong. Nicky's mental and physical resilience was clearly at a level I don't think any other driver in history can match, just on the basis of how quickly he recovered. There are guys who suffered less injuries than him who never returned to F1, the likes of Alessandro Nannini, or those who miraculously came back within a few years or far after their accidents but weren't the same, such as Graham Hill or Robert Kubica, but Nicky stands above them all because he came back so quickly from such problems and raced for immense pain. Now you could argue that by the time Nannini had recovered, the adaptations he would have required and the training he would have needed were too much, and especially in Kubica's case, he probably could have returned earlier, if not for the universally adopted protocols that simply didn't exist in Lauda's time, before the likes of Sid Watkins came along 2 years later and codified systems to prioritise driver safety. Even if Nicky had come back in Monza and finished last or outside the points, he'd have been applauded for his extreme determination to not just come back, but fight against severe pain, and the fact that he would redo his bandages every time he got out of the car because they'd be soaked in blood. Furthermore, Hunt had closed the gap in the title race to just 2 points with 4 rounds remaining, so with the pressure on, Nicky qualified as scarcely believable 5th, ahead of his teammate Reutemann, while the 2 McLarens of his rival Hunt and Jochen Mass started at the back of the pack due to fuel irregularities. The Brit crashed out trying to charge back up through the field, while Lauda dropped back into the midfield early on, but soon made his way back through the pack to finish 4th, only 20 seconds off the win after a cautious drive. He admitted he drove despite being petrified, a completely understandable stance, considering the circumstances, but he still finished in a fantastic position for a man who was on the verge of death merely 40 days earlier. This result increased his championship lead to 5 points, which then became 8 when Hunt's win from Brands Hatch was rescinded as an appeal by Ferrari into the events that transpired that day was upheld. Essentially, after a first lap collision that involved both Ferraris and Hunt's McLaren that brought out the red flag, James used the shorter club layout of the circuit to get back to the pits, but the rules stated that drivers could only take the restart if they made it back to the pits under their own steam. Ferrari argued that since Hunt had cut a large portion of the track out by doing this infield loop, he hadn't met this requirement, and after the appeal was investigated over several months, the FIA sided with Ferrari and handed the advantage to Lauda. James won in Mosport, which redressed the balance of the removal of his win, while Nicky finished outside the points in 8th, meaning the Austrian was still on 64 and the Brit still on 56, heading into Watkins Glen. The McLaren driver won again, while Lauda came 3rd, meaning the gap was down to 3 points, heading into the final round in Fuji. Hunt qualified 2nd with Nicky a close 3rd, but the heavens opened on race day. The track was soaked with water and rivers formed on some corners, which brought about the issue of aquaplaning. Brabham's Larry Perkins withdrew after one lap, as did Lauda at the end of the second tour, saying that his life was worth more than a title. This left Hunt needing just a 4th place finish to win the championship, which looked certain until the track started drying later in the race. He neglected to cool off his tyres by driving on the wet patches down the straights and suffered a puncture from the lead with around 10 laps to go, which dropped him out of contention down to 5th place, but he soon recovered, making his way past Clay Regazzoni, then Alan Jones, to stand on the 3rd step of the podium and clinch his championship crown. Lauda might have continued that day had he known the conditions would get better, but in reality this was a title he should have never been expected to win given what we know now. They have a similar reliability record across the season, yet Nicky's only 2 non-podium finishes came after an accident that should have killed him. If we took his early season form and extrapolated it to the rest, Lauda gets 110 points instead of 68, and even if you had a retirement or two and one otherwise poor race, he still would have won it at a canter. This is no shade on James Hunt, but he was not the best driver at any point in the season. He beat Nicky on merit only once before the accident in Spain, and while I wouldn't go as far to say he was an undeserving champion like a Damon or Phil Hill, he was definitely lucky to get his title. Nonetheless, heading into 1977, Lauda would be given a chance to recover properly, and he stayed on with Ferrari, although he did feel disgruntled with the fact that Scuderia wanted to replace him with Carlos Reutemann so quickly after his crash. He retired from the opening round in Argentina with fuel system issues, then finished 3rd in Brazil, before he took his first victory of the year at Kyalami in a race overshadowed by the death of the young talents Tom Price and a marshal in a tragic accident. Vibrations from a tyre lockup limited his race at Long Beach to a runners-up finish, and he failed to finish at the Spanish Grand Prix due to breaking one of his ribs while out on track, probably from a constant long yet slow-speed corners of the Jarama circuit in practice. He got consecutive second places in Monaco and Zolder, the latter of which being a potential win-loss for the Ferrari driver as he was held up behind a lapped car, the LEC of David Purley. Despite poor results in Anderstorp and Dijon, where he got only 2 points, he usurped Jody Scheckter for the lead of the championship, then pulled off an excellent string of 2nd and 1st places to pull clear of the South African driver, driving the plucky Walter Wolf outfit's machinery, before a less than stellar 4th position at Watkins Glen sealed the crown with 2 races to go. Lauda then decided to sit out the final rounds of the campaign, as he was leaving the Scuderia at the end of the season and didn't like the direction the team was going down. As mentioned earlier, Nicky felt they wanted to outright replace him with Reutemann far too soon after his big accident at the Nürburgring, and signing him to take the 2nd seat of Clay Regazzoni felt contrived too. Since the Scarlet outfit were behind the curve of the new ground effect technology, he'd already announced his move to the Brabham team, whose design was led by Gordon Murray, a future legendary figure who is yet to have his cars win a title. Unfortunately for Lauda and his new employers, their flat 12 engine was a hindrance to the Venturi tunnels that created downforce by sucking their cars to the ground, a similar issue endured by the Ferrari team until the early 1980s, and overall, the Brabham BT46 chassis was fast, but temperamental, as Nicky only finished 7 of the 16 rounds of the season, albeit every time he made it to the checkered flag, he stood on the podium, with 2 wins, 3 second places and a duo of thirds. The most notable event of the year, though, was at Anderstorp, where the Parmalat-sponsored outfit turned up to the weekend with a fan attached to the back of their cars, exploiting a loophole surrounding movable aerodynamic devices, and despite qualifying on full fuel tanks, to disguise the impact of their technology that was adapted from Jim Hall's Chaparral Can-Am cars from the late 1960s, they crushed the competition on race day, and Lauda won convincingly with over half a minute back to second place Riccardo Patrese. While 1978 had some redeeming qualities, the year following had none, as he only finished 2 of the first 13 rounds, and during a practice session he got out of his car, approached his team principal Bernie Eccleston, and told him he was retiring on the spot, saying he had no more desire to continue the silliness of driving in circles. The 2-time champion spent the next 2 years focusing on his own airline that he recently set up, Lauda Air, but it was during commentary for the 1981 Austrian Grand Prix when he realised he wanted to make a comeback to F1. He began a fitness regime and approached McLaren boss Ron Dennis about a potential return, the most likely avenue for success, as Lauda had briefly driven for the then young Dennis at his sports car operation in the late 70s, and after a test in September of 81 at Donington, where his lack of physical strength initially prevented him from completing more than a few laps at a time, by the end of that day he was within a tenth of current Woking driver John Watson. After much media speculation, he was announced in November of that year to drive for McLaren the season after on a then unprecedented $3 million salary, and announced his return by pulling the strings of a driver strike that happened prior to the season opening South African Grand Prix. I've already covered the strike and many of the other major parts of the FISA-FOCA war in my video I did on the 1982 campaign as a whole, but essentially, Lauda, being the intelligent person he was, took a look at the terms and conditions of his super license. To his shock, he realised there were clauses he didn't recognise, the most unsettling of which being that by having a super licence, drivers might be tied to drive for their teams for 3 years, regardless of other contracts. Thus, he approached the FIA and the other drivers about this issue, but when the governing body tried to dig their heels in, Lauda and a few others rounded up the entire grid bar one driver who arrived late, and they all stayed in the same hotel room planning to boycott the race. Eventually everything got sorted and they got racing in Kyalami, but coming back to F1 after years out and instantly standing up for bureaucratic nonsense is the most Niki Lauda thing that someone could ever do. His 1982 campaign overall was a decent one, definitely not on the same levels as his prime, but considering he was the first champion to make a comeback after a self-imposed break, he did an impressive job to win 2 races. Although in a year as bonkers as 1982, the fact he scored 5th in the driver's standings, despite amassing only 3 podiums in 16 races, proves my point as to why you should watch that other video. It was just a nuts season. He was plagued by mechanical setbacks in the sophomore campaign of his return, but heading into 1984, it seemed the arrival of a new hotshot lit a fire underneath the now 35-year-old Austrian. Alain Prost had proven that if his past 3 cars didn't spontaneously combust every 5 seconds, he could have won all of the last trio of titles, so when he came to McLaren to partner a proven champion, it created an interesting dynamic of youth and experience. The Woking-built car from that year was the best all-rounder, if not on one-lap pace, and Lauda looked on course to take first blood in the first race in Brazil, as he was leading by 40 seconds when his battery failed, handing the win to his French teammate. Niki fired back by winning at Kyalami, although that win also had a caveat as Prost had to start last because his car had problems on the formation lap, so he needed to hop in the spare chassis and claw his way back up to second. Both McLarens had mechanical issues in Zolder, then Alain won in Imola as Niki's engine expired early on. Prost got some bad luck of his own on home turf at Dijon when he finished 7th due to having to pit to change a loose wheel mid-race, while Lauda won. Then the wet Monaco event saw half points awarded and the French driver extend his gap to more than 10 points in the standings. The pair got a 2-3 finish in Montreal, with the more experienced of the duo in front closing their points gap, but this opened back up in Detroit as Niki failed to finish yet again. Neither driver finished the infamous Dallas Grand Prix, but at the next race in Brands Hatch, Lauda won while Prost retired, bringing the gap to 1.5 points. They brought home a 1-2 in Hockenheim, then Alain spun off on his teammate's home turf, while the Austrian went on to win at the Österreichring, handing the advantage to himself. Prost closed the gap, leading home another first and second place in Zandvoort, then drew level on the car issues front with his title rival as he dropped out of the Italian race early on due to gearbox trouble, opening the gap up to more than a race win's worth. At the first World Championship round held at the Nürburgring since 1976, Lauda praised the new shorter and safer layout utilised, although he finished a lowly 4th, while Alain went back to his winning ways, closing the gap to less than 4 points heading into the final event of the year at Estoril. Prost realistically needed to win to stand a chance at taking the crown, but all his teammate needed was second, and that's exactly what Niki got. He finished second, which meant that the pair were only separated by half a point in the final standings. Had Alain not called for the conclusion of the Monaco Grand Prix earlier in the year and taken the higher tally for second place behind Ayrton Senna in a full distance event instead of first in a shortened one, things might have been different. Nonetheless, Lauda was a fair champion as he outraced Prost 4-1 in races they both finished without issue, despite being on average 1.3 seconds behind in qualifying and never even having a sniff of pole position. He beat Alain at the game he would go on to play with Senna at the latter part of the decade. It's no matter starting in the pack if you got a car that's set up to save tyres, fuel or drivability. At the end of the day, you don't get any points for Saturday. Lauda's 1985 season was a big fall from grace though. He got one swan song win in Zandvoort, but finished only 2 more races before retiring at the end of the year to focus yet again on his airline. Niki often gets forgotten, especially by newer fans, as most will only know him as the guy who convinced Lewis Hamilton to join Mercedes, but in truth, he was the best driver of his era. He beat guys who were good enough to be champions in their own right, like Regazzoni and Reutemann, and lost out by only 1 point to James Hunt, despite everything that happened in 1976. He was better than John Watson at Brabham, but definitely worse when he came back at McLaren. To be fair though, Watson along with Didier Pironi came so damn close to winning the 82 crown, and probably both deserved it as much if not more than Rosberg, and I'd definitely argue both of them were championship calibre. For me though, what stands above these results is that 1984 season. It wasn't his best on raw performance, that has to go to either 75 or 76, but he was extremely consistent and still very fast during the races. It wasn't a fluke title, the head-to-heads and average gaps proved that, and they had the same reliability issues, and Nicky beat Alan at the game he would go on to master of consistency on race day. I'd argue that Prost didn't really have a definitive prime, it was pretty much the whole of his first career stint, so from 1981 or maybe 82 until his last year with Ferrari, so to beat him when even prime Ayrton Senna couldn't is a sign of just how great Lauda was, even when not in his best shape. He came back from near death to racing again in 6 weeks, and within 3 or 4 months it was like he never had the accident. The sheer mental fortitude that man had is something no other driver in history has even got close to. Schumacher had the technical know-how and the people skills, Prost had the politics and ability to calculate the best possible result without overstepping the mark, but for me, Nicky takes the best from both worlds. Add that onto his crash. Okay, Michael had the leg break at Silverstone, but it was nowhere near as severe, and that means Lauda is criminally underrated in F1 circles. He won 100% of the titles he should have done, which is a metric I use to determine overall driver performance, and only the likes of Clark and Fangio have a perfect record in that department, as I don't count 1976 as being a championship he should have won, because any points gained after the Nürburgring defy all possible odds on a personal level. That's why Lewis Hamilton is so low on my list, 9th overall because he has 7 titles, but from 11 title potential cars, he missed out on 2007, 2010, 2016 and 2021 all on his own merit. Schumacher missed out on 1998 and 2006, Senna and Prost's seasons interlaced with the season they didn't win his teammates, Fangio has 5 from 5, as he had more mechanical retirements than Farina in 1950, had an uncompetitive Maserati in 53, and retired midway through 1958, arguably still the best driver on the grid. Lauda doesn't quite reach the eternal greatness of Fangio and Clark for me, because their careers show no obvious driving weaknesses. I'd put Nicky on the same level as Prost, Schuey and Senna, since they were all flawed geniuses in a way. The other 3, due to dubious tactics, general sportsmanship, and in Senna's case, inconsistency against Prost, but Lauda is weird to rank because he's like a better version of Kimi Räikkönen. This is because in his first career stint, he was pretty flawless, but in his second part, lost the raw speed that seemed to be more natural to him before. Comparing 1975 Nicky to 1984 Nicky is like comparing 2005 Kimi Räikkönen to his 2012 or 2013 self. Nonetheless, I think Nicky Lauda flies under the radar for his career achievements in F1 and beyond, as not just a fantastic driver but a stand-up character who didn't put up with any bullshit, as the driver strikes proved, as the attempted boycott of a Nordschleife proved, and as his involvement in the investigation into the crash of one of his own aircraft, where he felt he owed it to the victims' families to give them an answer as to why their loved ones died, rather than being a corporate CEO only focused on statistics and revenue. Nicky was a great human being and a superb driver, but with that being said, I think that brings today's video to a close. I hope you enjoyed me detailing the career of one of F1's greatest champions, and if you did, please remember to like, comment and subscribe to see more content from me in the future. You can also subscribe to my Patreon if you'd like to see exclusive content, get videos a day early, and have an opportunity to converse with me personally for as little as $1 per month. Big shout out to my already existing Patreon subscribers Andy Lamberts and George Stratford, and you can also follow my X/Twitter account where I post boiling hot lava takes on F1, IndyCar and NASCAR, and follow my Instagram for behind the scenes updates. With my shameless plugging over though, I'm Nedzo, and I'll see you all later. Bye!